I am optimistic. I'm generally a very optimistic person.
This morning, Prince William sharing some rare personal insights with Eugene Levy.
Earlier this morning, Prince William shared rare and deeply personal insights with Eugene after a private family moment that left both him and Princess Catherine completely shaken. During what was meant to be a quiet, ordinary family dinner at Adelaide Cottage on the evening of Sunday, December 1st, 2025, their 9-year-old daughter, Princess Charlotte, said something so unexpected and disarmingly honest that it brought the entire room to silence. Palace staff who later learned of the incident were stunned. Senior royals were quickly called into emergency meetings, and questions began spreading throughout the monarchy about how no one could have anticipated it or what such a young princess could possibly say to send shockwaves through the royal household. The evening had begun peacefully, with William and Catherine enjoying rare uninterrupted time with their children, George chatting about football practice, Louis negotiating for extra Yorkshire pudding, and Charlotte unusually quiet as she picked at her meal. Catherine had prepared a simple roast chicken in the family's smaller, informal dining room, a setting chosen to preserve a sense of normalcy and privacy, but everything changed in a single moment when Charlotte finally spoke, uttering words that could not be taken back and quietly altering the course of the night and perhaps much more beyond it. William was the first to notice that something was off, as Charlotte had been unusually subdued throughout the meal, answering questions with brief replies instead of her typical thoughtful observations. He exchanged a quick glance with Catherine, who acknowledged she had noticed as well but wasn't yet alarmed, reminding herself that children have quiet moods and moments of private reflection. However, about 40 minutes into dinner, during a natural lull in conversation when everyone was focused on their plates, Charlotte spoke. Her voice was soft but unmistakably clear, cutting through the comfortable silence with words that felt far too heavy for a 9-year-old's dinner conversation. She admitted that sometimes she wished she wasn't a princess, believing that if she weren't, people wouldn't worry so much, her mother wouldn't have to be sick, and they could all live normally without being constantly watched or judged. The impact was immediate and profound. George froze mid-bite. Louis looked up in confusion but sensed the gravity of the moment. Catherine's face drained of color as her hand instinctively reached for her water glass, and William sat utterly still, his expression shifting from surprise to visible pain. No one spoke for several seconds, the silence thick with the realization that Charlotte had voiced truths the adults had worked tirelessly to shield their children from connections and patterns no child her age should have been able to perceive. Catherine was the first to recover, gently asking Charlotte what had prompted those thoughts, her voice carefully controlled. But Charlotte only shrugged, a gesture that carried both childlike innocence and an unsettling weariness, and quietly said it was something she had been thinking about for a while. William then leaned forward, hands clasped on the table, searching for words that could acknowledge her feelings without making the moment more overwhelming or frightening. William tried to soften the moment by explaining that being a princess came with challenges but also with opportunities to help others, make a difference, and be part of something meaningful. Yet Charlotte interrupted him, something she almost never did, to say that she already knew all of that because everyone always said the same things, but it didn't change how hard and sad everything often felt. She added that she could see it in the way her parents looked when they thought no one was watching, and that was when the room truly fell silent. Even George, who usually filled awkward pauses with talk of football or school, sat frozen, his expression suggesting he too had been carrying feelings he didn't yet know how to express. Catherine's eyes filled with tears she struggled to hold back, and William reached across the table to take Charlotte's hand, though he seemed unable to find words equal to the moment. There was nothing he could say to tell her she was wrong, because she wasn't, nor could he pretend royal life was easier than she perceived, as Charlotte had already shown she understood far more than they had realized. The rest of the meal passed in muted tones, with Catherine attempting to steer the conversation toward lighter topics, though the earlier warmth had vanished. By 7:30, the children were being readied for bed, with George and Louis moving through their routines while Charlotte lingered in the hallway, appearing as though she wanted to say more but wasn't sure how to continue. Once the children were settled, William and Catherine stood together in the cottage's small sitting room in silence, processing what had happened, realizing it wasn't that Charlotte had said anything inappropriate or revealed family secrets, but that she had expressed with heartbreaking innocence and clarity an awareness of the emotional cost of royal life they had hoped to shield their children from for years, something far deeper than ordinary childhood honesty. Charlotte had named the fundamental challenge of their family's existence with unsettling clarity, showing that at just 9 years old she understood how the pressures of royal life were affecting her mother's health, creating constant stress for her parents and making their family's life feel performative and endlessly watched. The heavy silence that followed her words at dinner lingered throughout the cottage that evening, and William and Catherine both sensed that something irreversible had shifted. Their daughter was no longer a child shielded from reality, but a young person already carrying burdens she should never have had to bear. To fully grasp why her confession shook them so deeply, It was not only what Charlotte said that mattered, but how she said it and the precise observations that revealed an awareness far beyond her years. Later that night, as Catherine gently encouraged her to talk while getting ready for bed, Charlotte revealed the fuller extent of what she had been noticing over the past months, speaking with careful precision that suggested these thoughts had been forming for some time. She explained that she could tell when her mother was having a difficult day, even when Catherine tried to hide it, citing specific details such as how her smile sometimes failed to reach her eyes during public engagements, how she moved more slowly on certain mornings, and how hushed conversations between her parents would abruptly stop when the children entered the room. Charlotte also shared that she knew people said unkind things about their family, especially about her mother, and that despite adults' efforts to shield her, she sometimes overheard fragments of conversations or noticed the worried expressions of staff members when they thought the children weren't listening. She recalled overhearing a palace aide mention public pressure and seeing her mother's reaction to something upsetting she had read on her phone. Most painfully for Catherine, Charlotte spoke about the weight of expectations, explaining that she could see how hard her father worked to care for everyone, how much responsibility he carried, and how tired he often looked, even when he was smiling and trying to be cheerful, observing that being royal seemed to mean always carrying more than anyone could see. Charlotte explained that being royal seemed to require constant perfection, never allowing space to show sadness, worry, or the simple desire for everything to pause for a while, and it was this level of maturity in how she articulated her thoughts that proved most unsettling. This was not a child's vague sense that something was wrong, but a remarkably sophisticated understanding of the precise pressures her family faced and how those pressures shaped her parents' behavior and emotional lives. She then shared something that cut straight to Catherine's heart, admitting that she sometimes pretended to be asleep when her mother came to check on her at night because she could sense Catherine needed a few quiet moments to herself and she didn't want to add to her exhaustion by asking for attention. The image of her 9-year-old daughter lying awake, feigning sleep to spare her mother additional emotional burden, devastated Catherine in ways she struggled to fully process. Yet perhaps the most heartbreaking revelation came when Charlotte spoke about her own future, explaining that she had been thinking often about what her life would be like as she grew older, whether she would be expected to shoulder the same responsibilities as her parents, and whether she too would be watched and judged in the same relentless way. She said that while she loved her brothers deeply, she sometimes felt frightened by what it meant to be the only daughter, aware that people already seemed to look at her differently and expect different things from her than they did from George and Louis, and she began to recall specific moments that had stayed with her. Charlotte went on to recall specific moments that had stayed with her, including a public appearance months earlier when a photographer had shouted for her to smile more and she saw her mother's face tighten with barely contained anger, as well as an overheard conversation between palace aides discussing how her public image would need to be carefully managed as she grew older. She also mentioned comments from other children at school who spoke casually about seeing her family in the news, unaware of how intrusive or uncomfortable that attention could feel. What gave Charlotte's words such devastating weight was the blend of innocence and awareness behind them. She wasn't being dramatic or manipulative, but was simply trying to describe, as honestly as she could, what it felt like to be herself, often lonely, pressured, and sad in ways she couldn't fully explain but could clearly feel. She told Catherine, in words that would linger painfully with both parents for days, that she sometimes wished she could just be Charlotte instead of Princess Charlotte, because being Charlotte seemed easier and maybe everyone would be happier. When Catherine gently asked what the difference was, her daughter's answer was heartbreakingly simple. Charlotte was who she was when nobody was watching, while Princess Charlotte was who everyone needed her to be. In that moment, it became clear that at just 9 years old, Charlotte had already internalized the performative nature of royal life, understanding that there was a public version of herself to maintain and that her family's values seemed, in some way, to be measured by public perception. Charlotte's words made it painfully clear that she understood how deeply her family's worth seemed tied to public approval and how her mother's struggles were connected to the constant scrutiny and judgment that came with their position, observations no 9-year-old should ever have to make. They revealed an awareness of adult realities William and Catherine had worked desperately to shield their children from until they were older and better equipped to process such complexities. Yet Charlotte had already absorbed these truths, quietly watching and understanding far more than anyone realized. That night, as Catherine tucked her into bed after listening to her daughter's careful and sorrowful explanations, she kissed Charlotte's forehead and promised they would talk more, while Charlotte, already growing sleepy, murmured an apology for saying things that might have made everyone worry. Catherine reassured her that she had done nothing wrong and that honesty about feelings was always welcome, even as she felt herself breaking inside at the realization of what her young daughter had been carrying alone. In the days that followed, William and Catherine looked back over the autumn of 2025 with painful clarity and recognized that Charlotte's confession had not come out of nowhere. The warning signs had been subtle but steady, accumulating over weeks and months while the adults around her were consumed by their own pressures. Changes had begun in late September after the family returned from Balmoral, and when Catherine later reviewed her journal entries from that period, She found repeated notes about Charlotte becoming more withdrawn, spending longer stretches alone in her room, asking to skip public appearances she once managed without complaint. At the time, Catherine had attributed these shifts to normal developmental changes as Charlotte approached her preteen years and made a mental note to monitor the situation, never realizing it required immediate attention. Charlotte's teachers at Lambrook School had noticed changes as well, though they hesitated to raise concerns, uncertain whether what they were seeing reflected a deeper issue or simply normal fluctuations in a child growing up under unusual circumstances. What had initially seemed like minor issues now appeared far more significant, as teachers had struggled to determine whether Charlotte's behavior reflected genuine problems or simply the normal emotional fluctuations of a 9-year-old. During a routine check-in, one teacher noted that Charlotte appeared less engaged in class discussions, more inclined to hang back during group activities, and occasionally lost in her own thoughts during lessons. Though these observations were presented as mild concerns rather than serious warnings, since her academic performance remained strong and she showed no behavioral issues or conflicts with classmates. Still, the teacher remarked on an unusual seriousness about Charlotte, as though she were carrying thoughts far heavier than typical childhood concerns. Palace staff who interacted regularly with the Wales children had noticed subtle shifts as well, with one household staff member mentioning privately to a colleague that Charlotte had grown quieter during car rides, less likely to chatter about her day or share stories about friends and activities. The staff member had wondered whether Charlotte might be experiencing teasing or social difficulties at school, but hesitated to raise the issue directly, fearing it might amount to nothing. Even George had sensed a change in his sister, though at 12 and navigating his own growing awareness of royal responsibilities, he hadn't known how to articulate his concern or whether to bring it to their parents' attention. Later, he told William that Charlotte had seemed sadder during the autumn term and sometimes made comments about things being unfair or difficult, remarks he didn't fully understand but could tell weighed heavily on her. Looking back, Catherine also recalled a specific incident from early October that now stood out as a clearer warning sign, when a family was preparing for a children's charity appearance and Charlotte, uncharacteristically, resisted getting ready, not through tantrums or defiance but by moving slowly and repeatedly asking whether she truly had to attend or if someone else could represent them instead. Catherine had gently but firmly explained that the family needed to attend the event together. And while Charlotte complied, Catherine later realized that her daughter's smiles throughout the appearance had felt forced, as though she were performing rather than genuinely present. Over the autumn, the pressure of being the only daughter in her generation of royals became increasingly evident, something Catherine had worried about privately without fully grasping how deeply Charlotte herself was feeling it. Unlike William, who had shared the experience of royal childhood with Harry, Charlotte had no peer within the family facing the same expectations. George, as the heir, carried different pressures. Louis was too young to confide in, and while the adult women around her were loving, they could not replace the understanding of a peer navigating similar scrutiny. In hindsight, Catherine recognized that many of Charlotte's recent questions, about whether Catherine had felt scared joining the royal family, whether learning the rules had been difficult, or whether she had ever wished to be normal, were not idle curiosity but attempts to make sense of her own emotions, though at the time Catherine had answered in general terms without realizing their deeper significance. Staff later shared that Charlotte seemed unusually attentive whenever her mother's health or public pressures were mentioned, even in conversations not meant for her, recalling moments when she stood quietly in nearby hallways listening, particularly a mid-November incident in which she overheard a palace aide discussing the need to protect the Princess of Wales's recovery and appeared noticeably subdued afterward. Individually, each sign had seemed manageable and easily explained as normal childhood adjustment, but taken together after Charlotte's confession, they revealed a clear picture of a young girl struggling for months, absorbing far more than anyone realized and trying to process overwhelming realities without the emotional tools to do so. In the days that followed, William was consumed by a profound sense of failure, recognizing that while he had been focused on institutional demands, Catherine's health, and preparing George for his future role, he had missed what was unfolding inside his only daughter, leaving her to carry these worries alone until they finally spilled out at the dinner table, a realization that cut deeply for both parents, who had believed they were shielding their children but had instead taught Charlotte to endure in silence. By mid-morning on Monday, December 2nd, word of Charlotte's confession had reached senior palace staff through discreet channels, prompting the Prince of Wales's private secretary to convene a small, trusted group at Kensington Palace, including the communications director, a senior aide familiar with the family, and a child psychologist, to consider the serious implications of a 9-year-old princess already struggling under the weight of royal life and what that might mean for the future care of the next generation. The situation raised urgent questions about how the institution approached the well-being of children born into royal life. Historically, royal generations had expected children to cope, adapt, and develop resilience through exposure and discipline, but modern understanding of child psychology and trauma suggested that such an approach carried serious risks. By early afternoon, King Charles had been briefed on Charlotte's statements in a carefully worded summary that conveyed the seriousness without unnecessarily alarming him about her immediate well-being. Reportedly, he sat in silence for several minutes before asking pointed questions about what specific support was being provided to Charlotte and what William and Catherine required from him. Having grown up under a very different system that prioritized duty and discipline over emotional expression or personal happiness, Charles had spent much of his life trying to reconcile those inherited values with contemporary understandings of mental health and family dynamics. Confronted with the fact that his granddaughter was struggling despite her parents' protective efforts, he appeared to recognize that institutional changes might be necessary. A family meeting was scheduled for the following morning at Windsor Castle, including Charles, William, Catherine, and Princess Anne, whose own experience navigating royal duty while maintaining relative emotional stability was considered invaluable. The agenda was weighty: to discuss what Charlotte's confession revealed about the current approach to raising royal children and to determine what adjustments might be needed. Concerns extended far beyond immediate emotional support, as advisors considered how Charlotte would navigate increased public attention and expectations as she matured, and whether long-term plans for her public role, patronages, and carefully managed image were viable if her ability to cope was uncertain. Senior staff recognized that this moment might necessitate broader institutional reforms. If royal childhood was proving too intense even for children raised by psychologically aware and protective parents, it suggested systemic flaws in how the monarchy approached the welfare of its youngest members. The traditional sink or swim model, assuming children would simply adapt through exposure and expectation, was increasingly difficult to defend in an era of heightened awareness about childhood trauma and mental health. Advisors privately debated the precedent this could set. If Charlotte's struggles required significant accommodations, what would that mean for future generations? Might the monarchy need to reconsider the multi-generational model in which even the youngest children participated publicly, moving instead toward a system that prioritized protection at the potential cost of visibility and tradition? Opinions among palace advisors were divided. Some feared that altering long-standing practices could set difficult precedents, while others argued that such changes were both overdue and necessary. They recognized that the monarchy's survival in the 21st century depended on public support, and that public approval increasingly required demonstrating that the institution prioritized human well-being over rigid tradition. If protecting Charlotte meant adapting how royal children were raised and publicly deployed, such adjustments would ultimately strengthen rather than weaken the crown's position. The palace response was still evolving, but several principles were emerging. First, Charlotte's immediate well-being was paramount, requiring whatever support and adjustments would help her feel safe and valued. Second, the situation needed to inform broader institutional thinking about royal childhood and the balance between duty and protection. And third, any changes had to be managed carefully to avoid creating public perception that the family was in crisis or that Charlotte required drastic intervention. Charlotte's confession, though painful for her parents, shed light on truths about royal childhood the institution had long preferred to obscure. Her experience is unique in some respects, as the only daughter of her generation in the immediate royal family, but it also reflects broader patterns that have shaped royal children's lives for generations. The pressures she faces as the daughter of the heir are distinctive. She is not the future monarch like her older brother George, yet she is not afforded the relative freedom of her younger brother Louis, who faces lower public scrutiny. Charlotte occupies a middle ground, carrying significant public attention and expectations without the clearly defined role that comes with being heir. William's own childhood provides a revealing comparison. At 9, he was beginning to grasp the weight of his future role, but he had Harry by his side, sharing both the burden and coping strategies of royal life. Charlotte has no equivalent companion within her immediate family. While William also grew up amid the strain of his parents' marriage, the relentless media focus on Diana, and the exposure of private family struggles to public entertainment, he drew from those experiences a fierce commitment to protecting his own children's privacy and creating a stable, loving environment. Yet Charlotte's confession suggests that despite William's efforts, some fundamental challenges of royal childhood pressure, scrutiny, and the weight of expectation cannot be entirely mitigated. Even in the most attentive and protective environment, Charlotte's childhood has been shaped by uncertainty and emotional challenges, regardless of how loving or protective her parents may be. Unlike George, whose future as king comes with structured preparation and a clear sense of purpose, Charlotte's role is less defined, leaving her dependent on family decisions about her visibility and responsibilities. This ambiguity can be more unsettling than the heavy but predictable expectations George faces. Adding to this, Charlotte has been carrying the emotional weight of witnessing her mother's health struggles over the past year. At just 9 years old, she has seen Catherine navigate a cancer diagnosis, treatment, and the physical and emotional toll of serious illness while maintaining public duties. Charlotte has been old enough to recognize the seriousness of her mother's situation, yet too young to fully process it or manage her own fear and anxiety. Her connection between Catherine's illness and the pressures of royal life, expressed during a dinner confession, revealed a depth of understanding that highlights her attempts to make sense of frightening experiences and seek explanations for why difficult things happen to loved ones. While it is impossible to know whether royal pressures contributed to Catherine's health challenges, Charlotte's belief in a connection illustrates the heavy cognitive and emotional load she has been navigating. This generation of royal children may differ from previous ones due to greater awareness of mental health and evolving social expectations around childhood protection, in contrast to the era in which William and Harry grew up, when emotional well-being was often considered secondary. Unlike previous generations, Charlotte is growing up in a time when her parents are both aware of and socially supported in prioritizing her mental health, yet they still face the challenge of doing so within an institution whose expectations remain largely unchanged. This generational shift may break long-standing patterns, but if Charlotte, raised by parents committed to her emotional well-being, still struggles with the pressures of royal life, it suggests that those pressures are fundamentally at odds with healthy childhood development. Such a realization could drive profound changes in how the monarchy operates, moving toward a model where children are largely shielded from public life until they reach adulthood and can choose their involvement with informed consent and emotional maturity. Continuing current practices, despite evidence of harm, is increasingly untenable in a society that values children's rights and well-being. Charlotte's candid expression of her struggles might serve as the catalyst for finally prioritizing the humans within the institution over centuries-old traditions and expectations. The impact on Catherine was immediate and profound. The night after Charlotte's confession, she lay awake long after William had fallen into exhausted sleep, replaying her daughter's words, wishing she could just be Charlotte instead of Princess Charlotte, noticing the constant worry around her, understanding that being royal meant performing rather than simply being. Each phrase resonated deeply because Catherine recognized them fears and observations she had privately carried for years. She had spent over a decade navigating the impossible balance between authenticity and royal duty, striving to shield her children from its complications. But Charlotte's words revealed a devastating truth. Her daughter had been watching everything, absorbing the subtle tensions and hidden costs of royal life, understanding far more than Catherine had intended. The realization struck with particular force, exposing that Catherine's own struggles, the very challenges she had meticulously managed in private, had become visible to her 9-year-old daughter. Every moment her public smile didn't quite reach her eyes, every quiet conversation with William about pressures and expectations, every day of careful negotiation had left its imprint on Charlotte's understanding of the world. Catherine was deeply troubled, realizing that Charlotte had developed the same hypervigilance she herself had learned early in her royal life, the constant awareness of being watched and judged, the exhausting effort to manage not only behavior but perception. Catherine had hoped her children would acquire such awareness gradually, with maturity and support to process it, but Charlotte, at just 9, was already carrying that burden. During sleepless nights following Charlotte's dinner confession, Catherine reflected on Diana's experiences and the tragic consequences of public pressure combined with institutional indifference to mental health. She had vowed her own children would never feel isolated, trapped, or dismissed for expressing their struggles. Yet here was Charlotte, having kept her feelings hidden until they erupted, and the difference now was that Catherine and William were truly listening. But listening was not enough. Real change was needed. The following days saw immediate and tangible adjustments. Charlotte was withdrawn from all public appearances for several weeks to give her the privacy to simply be a child, while Catherine personally contacted the organizations expecting her participation and arranged for carefully worded public statements framing the break as normal and supportive. At home, Charlotte began regular sessions with a child psychologist specializing in children facing public pressures, framed as a safe space rather than treatment. Catherine also committed to structured one-on-one time with her daughter, ensuring that these sessions were as non-negotiable as official duties. Beyond these immediate steps, William and Catherine began discussing broader changes to royal childhood, considering a more gradual approach to George's future responsibilities and shielding Louis from public life for longer. They questioned whether children should be visible public figures at all until adulthood, recognizing that tradition must bend when it conflicts with mental health. Charlotte's confession not only shaped adjustments for her but also affected her brothers. George began reflecting more openly on his own experiences, while Louis tried to lighten the atmosphere in his younger, playful way. The next significant step involved a scheduled conversation with King Charles, as William and Catherine knew that larger, systemic changes would require his support, balancing the institution's expectations with the urgent need to protect their children's well-being.